So I actually already made a video trying to balance Pokemon's type chart, but in all honesty I wasn't very satisfied with it. Most of it is because it was coming from a very defensive place that wouldn't make much sense unless you were immersed in the same discourse, but also it felt really incomplete since I only focused on like 3 types instead of all of them, so this video will be my more comprehensive attempt at balancing the type chart as a whole. Of course, I'll still mainly focus on types that need help, but in order to identify which types those even are, I need to define parameters for what is and isn't balanced. To me, balance would essentially mean that a type's strengths and weaknesses are equal in number, so a graph is probably the best way to visualize this, with the x-axis representing their total number of strengths, and the y-axis representing their total number of weaknesses. The diagonal running through each graph will basically represent the overall standard for balance, and I will be using multiple graphs, since the offensive, defensive, and overall properties of a type aren't always the same. Deviations from this standard will still be acceptable, especially if it's to preserve certain thematic choices like Normal's broad neutrality, Steel's defensiveness, or the starter type's relationship with each other, but ultimately my goal is to pull the extreme outliers closer to the standard range on at least one of these graphs. So to kick things off, I thought it'd be best to lead this discussion with the grass type because what better way is there to start than with a starter, right? Overall, grass is probably most known for having the most weaknesses of any type, but in my opinion, grass's most glaring flaw is actually rooted in its abundance of not very effective hits more than anything else. In fairness, grass was initially designed to rely more on status moves than on direct damage, but you could certainly improve its neutral coverage while still retaining that effect. So for my first change, I'm making grass neutral against flying and bug. It may seem weird to target these types when steel, fire, and poison are far more deserving targets, but losing their grass resistance isn't a huge deal for flying and bug, especially when they already resist fighting and ground, 2 of the best offensive types in the game. It helps that flying still has 3 resistances left, though to compensate bug for the loss of its 3rd resistance, I'm making it resist dark instead. This gives bug something to differentiate it from flying, which completely outclasses it otherwise, at least defensively, but either way it puts both types' defenses into equilibrium, which means I can now direct my attention to bug's offenses instead. Similar to grass, bug is just resisted by way too many types, so I want to improve it by making it neutral against ghost and fairy. Like the previous case, Ghost and Fairy are just defensive enough that they can afford the loss. However, I also felt that neutralizing them would be more impactful than if I had done the same to Fire and Flying, since they'd still be strong against Bug anyway. It helps that Ghost and Fairy's resistance to Bug doesn't make much sense in the first place, but in any case, there's only one more offensive outlier to cover, that being Poison. This one's kind of interesting, because Poison's defenses technically make it balanced overall, and since members of this type often deal damage by inflicting the Poison status condition, it's debatable whether it even needs any offensive buffs to begin with. However, since many still regard Poison as offensively bad even after Fairy was introduced to buff it, I think it's at least worth speculating what else Game Freak could have done to make Poison as relevant as they seemingly wanted it to be. It really only needs one more push to enter the range I've set anyway, so what I came up with is that rather than being weak to Fairy, fighting should be weak to Poison instead. This allows Poison to more fully capitalize on its resistance to fighting, since that's the one advantage it has which Steel lacks. Meanwhile, Fairy's strengths are redistributed so that it doesn't counter all of the metagame's biggest threats at once. It's a pretty simple fix that allows Poison to be about as relevant as Grass and Bug, and with that out of the way, we can finally move on to the defensive chart. For the sake of flow, I'll continue talking about Poison, but I actually won't change anything about its defenses since that's basically the only good thing about it. In fact, I'm not touching any of the types on the positive side of the chart because they're all pretty well balanced for the most part. I mean, Fire and Steel are weak to some of the most common attacking types in the game, which kind of offsets their resistances, and while Steel could obviously be reined in a lot more, it would need to lose like 6 resistances at minimum to reach the range I've set, so for the sake of preserving its identity, it's probably best not to judge it by the same standard. On the one hand, it's a bit disappointing that I couldn't find a way to fit any of these types into my tiny little box, but on the other hand, there is still one more outlier on the other side of this chart that could thankfully benefit from a bit of wrangling. So, when it comes to the Ice type, the main thing it needs is more resistances. Removing one of its weaknesses could work too, but since many Ice types struggle to get on the field in the first place, creating more switching opportunities is probably the most impactful way to increase their viability. Ideally, that means Ice should resist more common attacking types in order to maximize its defensive utility, so the best candidates for this role would probably be Ground and Water. Much like Poison, this serves to capitalize on Ice's existing advantage against both types, and while its effectiveness against Water is dependent on Freeze Dry, the Water resistance is still useful for walling opponents that only supplement their stab with Ice Beam. time. Overall, this puts ice roughly on par with grass and rock defensively, and while these specific resistances unfortunately create a lot of overlap with grass, ice's poor defensive profile and varying mileage from its water resistance thankfully prevent it from outclassing the grass type completely. They're pretty tame changes, all things considered, but with that, I've finally covered all my bases when it comes to the modern type chart. I'll try to show the differences between the real and revised charts along with the changes to my graphs, but pretty much every type I altered besides grass has entered the standard range of the overall chart. Of course, I could have taken some of these changes a lot further, but ultimately my goal was just to make some of the weaker types more viable, rather than outright threatening. Why is there still more runtime? So, you may be wondering why there's still more video left after I just finished balancing the whole type chart, and to be completely honest, I kind of felt the need to do more after realizing just how much of the previous section was rehashed from my original type chart video. It's basically the same information but streamlined, and since I'd hate to be redundant, I've decided that the best way to shake things up is by covering the previous type chart from generations 2 through 5. To be clear, that doesn't mean I want to apply these changes to gens 2 through 5 themselves. Rather, I'm doing this to see how Gen 6 could have balanced the type chart without creating the fairy type. This is in response to critics of the fairy type who believe it never should have existed in the first place, because while I think fairy deserves to exist even if it's imperfect, I also know that it wasn't the only way to address the type chart's balance issues. Let's pick up where we left off and start with ice, for example. Like all my other changes, the resistances I chose for ice in the last section were based on its existing matchups, but you might have noticed that there's one high-profile candidate that I basically glossed over, that being dragon. Compared to water, it arguably would have made more sense for ice to resist dragon since it's really powerful, competitively common, and naturally weak to ice. However, the main reason I didn't let ice resist it is simply because fairy would outclass it as a dragon counter. I guess fairy superiority wouldn't be as pronounced after the nerfs, but now that fairy isn't part of the equation at all, there's more room for ice to occupy its niche instead. That means ice will resist ground and dragon in this version rather than ground and water. However, I want to take dragon's nerfs a step further by making it weak to steel as well. This essentially creates two different kinds of counters against dragon, one for offense and one for defense, and while it might seem unwise to let steel counter yet another powerful type, at least this time there are actual reasons to use the alternative. Either way, the point of buffing steel this way is to give it some useful coverage now that fairy is no longer an option, as well as to differentiate it from fighting, which completely outclasses it offensively. However, that's not to say that steel will come out of this unscathed. Similar to the modern chart, I want to remove some of Steel's resistances in exchange for receiving such a significant offensive buff. However, rather than taking its Dark and Ghost resistances, I'm going to neutralize its resistance to Dark and Psychic instead. For Psychic, this serves to combat the waves of direct and indirect nerfing it's faced over the years in exchange for keeping one of the only other consistent counters against Ghost. Meanwhile, for Dark, its neutralization against Steel functions partially as compensation for letting Bug resist it like in the previous section. This specific change goes hand in hand with the other similar changes I made in the last section where like Bug and Flying lose their resistance to Grass, so I'm not going to explain those again. However, while I made Bug neutral against Ghost and Fairy for the modern chart, this time I'm making it neutral against Fire instead. This is mostly because Bug is Fire's least useful resistance after Grass, but like since I don't want to touch Grass and Fire's relationship, I feel more comfortable dropping Bug, but also because instead of making Bug neutral against Ghost, I wanted to reserve that neutrality for another type this time. In this case, I wanted to make Poison neutral against Ghost because super effectiveness against fighting just wasn't enough to reach my arbitrary standard anymore, and the results are okay. It at least allows Poison to enter the same offensive range as Electric, but to be fully transparent, I don't love this change from a thematic perspective. Ghost's resistance to Poison just makes slightly more sense than its resistance to Bug since Ghosts don't have a body to Poison, but of all the types that Poison could be neutral against, Ghost was ultimately the most deserving target. Well, besides Steel, but it felt weird to neutralize an outright immunity, so I didn't do it. In any case, this is the best I could do to balance the type chart without Fairy, and it hasn't really changed my opinion about its necessity. Granted, Steel and Dragon are in roughly the same position as they are in the modern chart, but the buffs to Poison and the nerfs to Dark and Fighting are so much less impactful specifically because the types replacing Fairy aren't as powerful. Of course, there are plenty of non-Fairy related changes that are important too, but they're essentially variations on what I did in the last section. At the very least, there are fewer outliers this time, namely Normal, Grass, and Steel, but I think I could have fit every type into the standard if it weren't for Steel. Speaking of which, while it might seem redundant to do the same thing thrice, you'd be surprised by how much mileage I can get out of the same concept. I know it might seem weird to do this since the original type chart has been obsolete for like 30 years now, but after modifying the second type chart to see if Fairy was really a necessary addition, I wanted to do the same with Dark and Steel. I feel like we mostly just accept Dark and Steel because they were introduced immediately after Gen 1, whereas Fairy was released into a firmly established metagame, but if people are willing to scrutinize Fairy's place in the game because it's overpowered, then they should be able to direct that same amount of energy toward a type with 11 resistances. So for the final act of this video, I will try to balance the original type chart without adding Dark or Steel, though I should disclaim that I've only played Gen 4 onwards, so I don't know how meaningful these changes would have been going into Gen 2. To begin, let's start with Dragon, because of all the types to exist, Dragon is the only one that's ever been completely unresisted. This wasn't much of a problem in Gen 1 since the only dragon move in existence did set damage, but since future dragon moves would inevitably deal regular damage, it makes sense that Game Freak created Steel to counter it. Of course, since Steel isn't available for this thought experiment, the most obvious replacement for it is Ice for the reasons I stated before, but unlike previous sections, I don't feel the need to bolster Ice's defenses any further since this version has fewer weaknesses to offset. In fact, fewer types resist this version of Ice too, which is why I actually feel comfortable nerfing its offenses for once as well. In this case, I want to neutralize its effectiveness against grass in addition to my usual move of making grass neutral against flying, and while this might not be very different from my other buffs to grass in terms of quantity, this actually allows it to enter the range of overall acceptability due to Steel's absence. It's a huge achievement for a type that seemed like it would never even touch the standard range, and is part of why I wanted to use these older charts rather than simply altering the modern one. That being said, not every type is so lucky, and nowhere is that more evident than in the case of Bug. You may have noticed that, unlike previous sections, I didn't neutralize Bug's resistance to grass, and that's because its defenses are much worse this time. It has a 4th weakness to poison, its resistance to fighting is less valuable, and worst of all, Dark can't even replace grass as a resistance due to its absence. The best I can do to offset Bug's weaknesses is to make it resist Psychic, and while it's a very valuable resistance to have, Bug is a massive downgrade from Dark when it comes to hard countering Psychic. Thankfully though, Bug doesn't have to be the only form of counterplay to Psychic because the subsequent type chart made a very necessary change that I will implement too, that being Psychic's weakness to Ghost. This is unlike any other change I've made in this video because this decision pulls a full 180 on these types' relationship, but since Psychic's initial immunity to Ghost does seem to have been an error, I'm more comfortable reversing this type interaction than I would any other. However, since Ghost is lacking in weaknesses itself, I'll also make it weak to Psychic so there's more varied counterplay to it. It's kind of an odd solution that doesn't fully address how Ghost is nearly unresisted now, but at the very least it keeps Ghost from becoming yet another outlier by turning its new gain strength into more of a coin toss. It's certainly not the only type with a weird two-sided relationship in this type chart, and conveniently, that brings me to the last type in this section, Poison. Now, at this point Poison and the type chart overall are already balanced, but because Poison's offenses are practically useless, I want to throw it a bone by making it neutral against Ghost again. This is basically the only buff it can afford since fighting isn't valuable in this chart anyway, and there aren't any more obvious types to make Poison strong against. But if nothing else, this allows Poison to have marginally better neutral coverage while pulling Ghost ever so slightly closer to the average. And with that, I'm finally done with the original type chart. I feel like that last entry wasn't the strongest note to end on, but based on where I started, I just couldn't segue anywhere else. Overall, this process led me to the kind of obvious conclusion that Dark and Steel were in fact necessary to provide more reliable answers to Dragon, Ghost, and Psychic, but I still think it was worth questioning the balance of these types regardless of how long they've been around. Okay, before I close out the video, I want to go on a little tangent regarding some matchups that I considered changing but ultimately decided not to. First is Normal. I didn't have any particular changes in mind, but I wanted to bring it up because I know some people want to buff it offensively. I understand why people want Normal to be more, well, normal. It's the only type without super effective coverage, so it's virtually useless barring a few high base power moves, but I feel like buffing Normal offensively would defeat the point of it being a basic neutral attacking type. In fairness, it does have a few non-neutral interactions with Ghost Rock and Steel, but anyone who's complained about types like Psychic Dragon and Ghost being overpowered knows exactly why those negative matchups are so important. In any case, tampering with Normal's offenses won't make it any more neutral, so although an offensive buff would probably make it more relevant, I've decided that maintaining its thematic cohesion is more important. After that, I considered neutralizing Rock's weakness to ground since the former has a lot of weaknesses and the latter can afford to do it, but since both types are within the standard, it seemed kind of unnecessary. And lastly, while I thought about making Steel weak to Electric, I realized that doing so might make Electric a little bit too powerful. This is because it's already strong against the ever-relevant Water and Flying types, so adding Steel to the list might replicate the problem everyone has with Fairy, namely that a single type has an advantage over multiple metagame threats. I guess I didn't have to choose Electric since it's not the only type to resist Steel, but compared to Water, which sits right on the standard line, Electric just seemed more deserving of a buff. Either way, it's not like a single nerf could even dent Steel's defensive profile anyway, so realistically this change would basically just power creep Electric without solving the initial problem with Steel. Overall, I don't actually know how balanced any of these type charts would be in practice. Even after trying to buff Grass, for example, it's probably worse off now due to Bug and Poison always receiving buffs. Meanwhile, several changes in the modern chart would likely improve Fire's defenses despite receiving no direct changes otherwise. It's strange to think that even after laying out such a specific criteria and methodology, I still can't confidently say whether my charts are better than the originals, but if nothing else, I can at least say I'm more satisfied with this iteration of this video concept than my previous attempts. A big part of it is that I put up several walls of text in the other video that were probably annoying to read and definitely annoying to write, but it was also just interesting to see how the type chart has evolved after going through each iteration of it in this video. As incremental as it's been, I feel like Game Freak has always made thoughtful improvements in the few times they have updated the type chart, and while obviously I think they could do it better, this process has made me appreciate certain changes even more because I feel like I have a better understanding of the logic behind them. I don't know, I feel like it's kind of a hot take to say that Game Freak did anything right these days, but that's just kind of what I took away from this experience. If you have any alternative ideas for how to balance the type chart, then feel free to comment, but if you have critiques of my changes specifically, then it might be useful to clarify which type chart you're referring to. I really didn't do myself any favors by covering them backwards, but the way I would label them are the modern chart, previous chart, and then the original chart, respectively. If not, you could also refer to them by the generation they debuted in, but otherwise, that's all I got, so bye! Funnily enough, despite trying to balance every type chart, none of my revisions are quite what I consider the perfect version of it. The revised modern chart is extremely close, but I'd want Steel to resist Ghost instead of Psychic for basically the same reasons as in my Gen 2 chart. I probably could have brought it up earlier rather than implementing it separately, but I didn't want too much overlap between sections. Oh yeah, also I wasn't wearing like a vest during most of those sections, I was actually just like wearing... wait, give me a second. I was actually just wearing like some pants around my neck. Like, it kind of looks like a vest or like a priest's stole, but I was sort of just crossing them over a bit like this. It kind of looks nice, but obviously it's like I can't just wear this in public. I also kind of clip them like this. I just wanted them to like stay crossed. I guess I didn't have to. I probably could have just done it like this. But then it would just look like I'm wearing a square.